Please welcome to the stage, Michele Borba.
We all have our unforgettable moments. Mine was April 20th, 1999. I was watching the Columbine High School massacre unfold, and I realized there was a seismic shift happening in our culture and our children's world, and I spent the next few years studying youth violence. I went all over studying it, and I wrote a bill on how to prevent school shootings. I was presenting those recommendations to the assembly when all of a sudden my next unforgettable moment happened. It was a teen with very baggy jeans, walks by me holding his pants up so they wouldn't fall and yells out, "Great speech." Now, what could this kid possibly like about what I said? All the stuff about teaching people to care. That's the stuff we need to learn, you know, the goodness stuff. Bingo. On the spot, this kid was right, and he changed my entire mindset for the next 17 years. I was on a search to find the answer. My journey took me far and wide. I walked the killing fields. I went to Dachau, Auschwitz, talked to some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, and I also interviewed hundreds of kids. I found the answer. The answer to goodness is empathy, the ability to feel with another human being. And why would you want to empathize? Oh, let me count the ways, folks. Number one, it's very highly correlated to predicting our real happiness and success. It what also activates our heart, so we're more likely to step in, be courageous, be compassionate, be contributing members of society so we can re-evolutionize our world. But it's also the best antidote we have right now to stopping bullying, ending racism, and opening up the doors to each other. It's our hope for humanity, and that's why I'm concerned. You see, we have a serious crisis from zip codes from coast to coast, and that is in the last 30 years, today's kids are 40% lower in empathy, and in the same 30 years, their narcissism rates have increased 58%. Call it the selfie syndrome, folks, but what we're dealing with is self-absorption kills empathy. What we need to be doing is raising unselfies, not selfies. Number two, we need to start putting up close and personal on our agendas empathy, because to me it's the best seeds we can bring to really restore humanity. And it's my contention that empathy is anything other than soft and fluffy. It is an integral, essential piece that we have got to start realizing we can cultivate. Because the other best thing about all of this is that though we're hardwired to care, don't think it's innate. We need to exercise our empathy muscles. So now the next question is, how? How do we open up our hearts? And surprisingly, it was a few more kids who gave me the best answers. If we listen to kids, these are the ideas we should spread. First idea was in Fort McMurray, Canada, way far north. The superintendent told me, you just have to go and visit this classroom. It's really an amazing classroom. They're learning emotional intelligence there. So I was curious. I walked in, sat down at the end of a great big green rug, and for the next 30 minutes, I began to first listen to the kids who were busy giving me instructions. Step one is, they said, about their teacher. Stay still. He startles really easily. Oh, don't look sad, he'll cry. I was becoming a little concerned about this teacher when all of a sudden the door opens and in walks a mom carrying her baby. She puts the baby in the middle of the rug, and I sit back and I watch in absolute awe, the most brilliant lesson I've ever seen in empathy. Question number one was from the real teacher. How does Clara seem to be feeling today? And all the kids, they were tuning in, they were observing, they were watching her emotions, and boy, they had it. Well, she looks a little anxious. How do you know? Because her hands are in fists. Oh, maybe we should all smile to make Clara feel better. And the little one next to me says, Clara's learning empathy. Indeed, but it wasn't just Clara, it was the group of 30 third graders who were also tuning in. The program's unique. It's Roots of Empathy. It's by Mary Gordon. Hundreds of kids have been exposed to it, thousands. But here's the real thing. 9 studies already prove that it reduces bullying and increases empathy. But why? It's because the kids were actively experiencing and witnessing empathy. Big mistake we make is, okay, kids, now fill out the worksheet. We're going to learn empathy. Or it's 9 o'clock. Let's talk about empathy. No, we got to weave it in because it's up-close personal moments. As the kids would tell me, first idea, empathy is a verb. It needs to be active. It needs to be meaningful. It needs to be real. And when we have those kinds of moments, they're usually spontaneous. They can also be transformational. Example was Darren. Darren was struggling in school. He was held back 2 years. His mother was murdered in front of him when he was 4. He lived in a series of foster homes. He wanted everybody to think he was tough, but inside this kid was hurting, but he was also in a Roots of Empathy class. And that day, when a mother brought her baby, she shared with the kids that her child didn't like to be cuddled. And surprisingly, it was Darren who walked up and asked if he could hold her baby. And the mother, a little apprehensively, gave Darren the baby, in which case he walked over to his side and he gently rocked this child over and over until he walked back to the mother and asked the question, if you've never been loved, do you think you can still be a good father? Empathy moments can transform us on the inside so we see ourselves and we see others in a different light. But it's always those up-close verb kind of moments that are critical, and that's why we should all be worried, because those up-close verb kind of moments are disappearing. We're in a generation that would rather text than talk. The average child is now plugged in about 7.5 hours a day. Our infants, our little Claras, are now 1/3 of them using iPads, and we are conveying our emotions by circling emojis. Well, folks, you don't learn empathy facing a screen, which just means the first step of all of this, the kids would say, is we got to tune in. We got to tune in a little more so that we can do the seeds of empathy, read how the other person is feeling. There's lots of ways to do it. It doesn't have to be hard or expensive. It's just intentional, like creating some unplugged digital times in your home or in your office. Or do what one fraternity did and change their whole life. They set a new rule. The new rule is when you go out to dinner, everybody put your cell phone in the middle of the table, and the first person to touch their cell phone pays everybody else's restaurant bill. They reclaimed the art of conversation very quickly. First thing is, folks, we got to get on board here with empathy. We got to do what the kids said, and remember, empathy is a verb, but that's not the only idea. There's 2 more if we're going to reactivate our hearts. You see, we also know we're more likely to empathize with those in our own social hub, people we're familiar with. So how do we open our hearts to them? Or even better yet, how do we break down prejudice and stop hate? Once again, it was kids who had the answer, but this time it was a most unique summer camp. Now, picture it, because it's kind of Norman Rockwell-ish. It has a sparkling lake. It has the woods. It's in Otisville, Maine. It's a camp like we all went to that has archery and canoeing, but what's different are the campers. They're 14 to 16-year-old teens. They've been selected for their leadership abilities, and they're flown in from all over the world in war-torn areas. Now, just imagine. They come in from Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, as well as the United States and Britain. And they come in for 3 weeks to this camp, which was founded 30 years ago by somebody I think is a real visionary. His name was John Wallach, a reporter who said, forget the adults, we're never going to get to them. The conflicts are going to keep going. How about we reach the kids? We get to the kids earlier, and maybe they can be a seed who can go back and plant peace in their own countries as a future leader. Sounds idealistic, but it's working. 30 years later, they've been tracking kids, University of Chicago. And a very large, significant portion not only have made friends with the other side, a person you have been taught to hate your entire life, but 30 years later, they're continuing to advocate for peace. So why does it work? First, it is called the Seeds of Peace International Camp, and it is a miracle place. When I visited, what I saw instantly was everything from the activities to the atmosphere, to the skills these kids were learning. It was all about strengthening human connection, everything. The other thing that I saw that was over and over again is that they were breaking out their social hubs, so the kids were starting to stand over and meet somebody who was them. For instance, they ate, they slept, they also talked together. They learned skills that opened up your hearts. That's the thing we may also be forgetting to do. Empathy is made up of habits that we need to work on. What did these kids learn? Communicating, collaborating, perspective taking, so they could step into the other person's shoes. One of the most amazing things I saw at this camp were signs everywhere that were taped to the doors and on the woods that said, stop and talk. Stop and talk. And I looked at those signs and go, my God, they should be mandatory in our homes, our schools, our communities, because it's the first step. You got to be aware the other person exists. But what these kids were doing was practicing empathy habits. See, you first develop empathy, then you practice it, and if you practice it enough, then you can live it. Slowly, the kids said, very slowly, your heart begins to open up. It takes time, they said. You know, it takes time because you've been taught your whole life to hate that guy. But because you keep practicing those habits, pretty soon the moment happens. I said, what's the moment? He said, the moment is the miracle stuff. Your heart opens, and you see the person not as an enemy, but another human being. It's a real miracle. The teens also said, when you leave here, you're changed from the inside out. You'll never be the same. I saw the miracle that day, this. And I sat and looked at this and go, my God, this is also what we all should be doing. Can you imagine a more peaceful society when we practice habits of heart? And those kids would also say the key to keep in mind is that the real miracle is practicing them. The motto of this camp is the way life should be, the way life could be. And I looked at it and went, that's exactly what we could be doing. Practicing those habits so they open our hearts. But the idea we're spreading is we got to practice habits of we. That's not the only one. There's one more. And the last habit I learned, the last idea we're spreading, actually happened in Rwanda, a place where vicious, horrific stuff had happened. And just imagine, in 100 days, over 800,000 people were massacred in the most horrific genocide. This is neighbors killing neighbors. So if you ask me, what's the real danger of empathy going down? When empathy wanes, so does humanity. We've also got to keep in mind, folks, that we have got ourselves in such a narrow view of what success is these days. It's like this. It's all a metric of success, that it's a GPA or an SAT. Let's widen it so it's also Humanity 101, that there's genius stuff on the other side of the report card. And we also better start prioritizing this stuff. I mean, we don't prioritize it. When's the last time you saw a parent with a bumper sticker on the back of their card that said, proud parent of a kind kid? It's low on our agendas. Let's raise it up. We don't even exercise our hearts. Oh, we're good at doing everything else. We go to the gym. We cart our kids to this and this and this and this. We're on everything on demand. But we don't practice those habits of we that kids would say were so essential. And if we did, can you imagine how the world would be a better place, the way life could be? Rwanda, though, was where I learned the third idea. I was visiting an orphanage. These children were just incredible kids, but they were all deaf-mute children whose parents had abandoned them. Their grandparents were slaughtered in a genocide, and I was distributing nothing more than very simple little backpacks that were packed by kids back home. What was in them? Oh, a notepad, a ruler, a pencil, gum, a little stick of candy. And the kids were so excited to get these backpacks as they started just pouring everything out, because of course they didn't own a backpack. But I watched one little guy off to the side, and I kept watching him pull and pull and pull until he was almost in a frantic mode. What did he need? You know, like more candy, or was he looking for another stick of gum? Nope. And he kept looking until all of a sudden it was the finding. The one other thing that each child had had in their backpack was a handwritten note from a child back home. And that was the only thing he was looking for, that handwritten note. When he pulled it, he pulls this note so carefully and then opens it and start to read the words. And I walked a little closer to him and I read behind his shoulder, and boy, they were pretty simple. Hi, I'm 10. I live in Minnesota, and I packed this backpack for you. I hope you like it, because I was thinking about you. Your new friend from the United States, Mark. He read it again and again, and then he held it so carefully against his heart. He turns to look at me, and I'm a basket case. He points to my tears, and he points to his, and then he signs the word for love. I sat there and went, oh my gosh, here's the moment of moments when I'm with him. We are emotionally in sync. They're rare, they're spontaneous, and they're pretty quick. But I was feeling for him, but I also realized at that moment that is the basic human need for every child and every grown-up, from poverty to privilege, just the human connection. And that's the piece that seemed to be dwindling. We can keep our hearts open for so many different ways, but one of the things is just starting with one. One child is what activates our heart. Working with one person, just feeding one person in a food bank, just starting with one. Think big, but start small, folks, and we can reactivate our hearts so well. There's one other thing that there's a danger that we better worry about, and that is what's called compassion fatigue. We see so much of the doom and gloom of the world today on closed caption TV that's constant. How do you keep your empathy open so it doesn't create that numbness? You do what Mr. Rogers would tell you to do. Look for the helpers. Look for the good ones. Look for the caring. Look for the compassionate. Their stories are always on the back page, by the way. They're there on the back page of the newspaper. What we got to do is cut those stories out and give them to our kids, give them to our colleagues, keep our empathy open. Mother Teresa said something absolutely brilliant. She said, when I look at the mass, all the numbers, all that are suffering, I'll never act. But if I look to one, I will. Empathy starts with one. It's the spiraling trajectory that we can open up our hearts. But we got to keep in mind something that's so critical. Empathy is what makes us better people. Empathy. Empathy is the best investment we can make for our future. Empathy. Not technological power, industrial strength, and military might, but human capital. What we need to do is advance people skills. And that's what we seem to be lying dormant with these days. We're putting everything into everything else but ourselves. Now, there's hope, folks. There's hope. We can make a difference. I know it because I've seen it. But what the kids would tell you to do is just remember 3 ideas worth spreading. Idea number 1 is practice habits of heart. Just remember those habits, but keep practicing them over and over again. Think of empathy as just we, not me, but also think of empathy as a verb. It's real, it's meaningful, it's active, but it's always, always face-to-face connection. And finally, do one more thing. Just start with one. If you start with one, your heart will open. It will continue to. And the most amazing thing, you pass it on to another person. Compassion is courageous for the way life could be and should be. I hope you're with me. Thank you. Thank you.